We've done a lot of programming stuff so far, but I think today what we're going to do is we're going to get started with a little bit of art, because we've got these little pickup things, these little collectibles for our little platforming game that we're learning to Unreal develop with. But they're a bit boring, aren't they? They're just white boxes. So let's make some gems, little diamond things, as something quick and easy to also start learning Blender. Now, I'm working off of Blender 0.5 because that's the latest stable release as of time of recording this. Largely everything should more or less stay the same, even with newer versions, but there might be minor differences if you're watching this very far into the future. What we're going to do is we're going to get started here with just a general scene, and you just press the A button and then the delete key, and everything goes. Everything is gone. We don't need any of the lighting or the cameras because we're not going to be making an animation. We're not going to be making a movie in here. We're just going to use this to make some assets. Now, one thing that is kind of tricky to get right is the scale of things, because we're in Blender and we don't know how big anything we make is. And for the most part, it's not the most important thing to have things really like work out in terms of how big they are, because we can always just scale them down once we're in engine. That said, it is pretty good to just kind of get used to making things in the right scale, because if you think about the scale that you're making things in, you're going to be making things in the same relative scale between different Blender projects as well. So all your different assets are going to more seamlessly fit together. What we're going to do is we're going to get started making a little diamond. And the way that we're going to do that is with Shift and A, you get this little adding menu. And we're going to start by just adding in a default cube. You might think, hey, didn't we just delete the default cube? Welcome to Blender. First thing you always do, remove a cube. Second thing you do about 90% of the time, add a cube. From here, because we're going to make something very symmetrical, it's actually quite nice that Blender has some symmetry options for us. One of the more powerful ones is an add-on that might not be enabled by default. So if you go into Edit and then Preferences, you get this menu here. And one of the things you can go into is add-ons. If you look up mirror, you have auto mirror. It might not be enabled by default. For me, it is enabled because I've got this thing for years. But it does by default just come with Blender. It's not something that you need to buy, not even something that you need to separately download. It just exists within Blender. So you just kind of tick this checkbox to on or off, and then back to on. And now it should be an available tool for you to use. If it gives you this missing built-in add-ons thing, by the way, sometimes maybe you need to click on that and install them. For this, it's only a material library and tri-lighting and stuff that we're not going to be using. With that, we can then press on this little thing over here, and it actually opens up our editor menu. If we then go into Edit, we have Auto Mirror as a tab here, and we can auto mirror this in the X, the Y, or the Z direction. Either positive or negative direction, meaning left to right or right to left. What we're going to do is we're going to mirror this in the X direction, and then we're also going to mirror this in the Y direction. And you might think nothing has happened, and visually you would be right. But if I press the Tab key, or go up here and go into Edit mode, Tab key just switches to Edit mode for us, you will see that the geometry here actually only has a quarter of the entire cube. And that's because what this auto mirror does is it slices your object in half along the axis that you specify it as, and then automatically goes into your modifiers stack. Blender is a very non-destructive way to model if you do it properly, because it procedurally adds these modifiers. So it's mirroring along the X and along the Y, just as I specified. We can turn off the modifiers here, at least visually, and you can see this is actually the bit of the model that we have left over. Then it just mirrors and it does all the vertex snapping and all that kind of good stuff, and there we have it. The reason that we do that is because now, if we move this one vertex, it mirrors it in all directions, which is super, super nice. If we switch back to object mode, and you just have a like JPEG somewhere on your computer, you can just kind of drag it into Blender, and it will just be put in as a reference image for you within Blender itself, which is kind of nice. We can set this to being location 0, 0, 0, and then the rotation we can also set to 0, 0, and 0. And then we can start rotating this thing like we want it to. So we can set this rotation in the X to 90, the Z probably also to 90, and then just pull this thing back. You can move things in Blender while you have them selected with the G key, and then you can lock them to an axis by pressing the corresponding letter. So X or Y or Z. So we move it back in the X-axis a little bit. And what's wonderful is with the keys that are on your numpad, if you don't have a numpad, these might be mappable, but please just make sure that you have a numpad. You have these default perspectives that you can work with. So 1 is a side view, 3 is a front view, 7 is the top view, and then we have a couple of like half views, which I honestly don't ever use. But 3 lets you look at this from the front. The reason that that's really, really helpful is because it can help you shape things based on a reference image. Now, if I go up here and I toggle X-ray, my object will actually become see-through. If I then go into edit mode by pressing tab, you might not see that I'm in edit mode very well. But now what I can do is I can quite easily just start matching all this in shape. Now, I do actually want to move this a little bit to the right side and a little bit down so that this point is actually at the exact middle point of my cube, because it's going to be the symmetry point, of course. Then I can select the cube again, go back into edit mode. Well, that's actually pretty much spot on. And then if I press the G key twice in a row, I get to slide vertexes along their lines that they're connected to. So that way we always have the possibility to just make it in line with where it should be. And then I can select this by just clicking on it, or I like to box select it, because when you box select, you make sure that everything behind it, as long as you're in X-ray mode, also gets selected, which is quite nice. And then we can just move this in the same way that we moved that plane before. Pressing the G key and then pressing the axis that we want to move it in. I want to move this down, right? So move this down, G key, and then the Y, move it to this side. Then box select this, G key, Z key, move it down. Maybe have it a little bit more upward. And just like that, we have the basic shape of the center of our diamond. Now we need to build this out in a way where this shape starts to come all the way across, and then we'll only have it working from the frontal perspective, but then we'll be able to also add a reference image to the side, and that way you can kind of like trace model these kind of things fit. So the way we do that is we need to add more geometry now. And adding more geometry, you can do that with these cubes by pressing Ctrl and R, and that lets you add in a loop cut. So if we have a loop cut here, that adds new geometry, we can slide it up and down. And you can see it's a little bit on an angle, and we don't actually want that to be on an angle. So if we just put that roughly in place where we want it to be, and then we scale this in the Z, because we can move things in any axis, we can also scale them in any axis. And we just say, actually, we want this to scale to 0. That makes it just a straight line, which is very helpful. Then we just take this straight line and we move it out. Maybe you want to move it a little bit up as well. You can tweak this as you desire. But now we pretty much have this shape of a diamond just from the frontal perspective. So what we can do next is we can copy this over by pressing Shift and D. That copies things in Blender. Then if we press Shift and Z, we can now move this thing in every axis except for the letter that we pressed. So Shift and X would be Z and Y. Shift and Y would be X and Z. Shift Z is X and Y. If we then look at this from the top perspective, we can rotate this along the Z by 90 degrees. And we can kind of just position this thing in a way where it lines up pretty much perfectly with the side perspective. If I now press numpad 1, you can see there we are. Clicking back onto our diamond, we can keep on editing this. So now we pretty much just need to do the same thing from this perspective. So we select these, use the G key to move them in a little bit. It's not an exact science. The fact that it's a little bit offset, it's fine, right? It doesn't matter that much. We can take these vertices, move them maybe even down a little bit, and then move them in. Take these ones, move them out a little bit. And just like that, we have a very low poly and very low sided diamond. It basically has the shape that we need it to have. So let's just delete, or well, make them invisible. We don't actually delete them. Those little things. And now we just need to add in more sides, effectively. So right now, all that we've been doing is manipulating individual vertices, which is fine. But we also have edge mode, which lets us select entire edges, or face mode, which lets us, you guessed it, select entire faces. If we go into edge mode and we select this edge and then this edge as well, which you can do by just selecting things and then holding down shift as you select the next one. Pressing B lets us bevel this edge. And with a beveled edge, we now suddenly have a fair bit more definition, like instantly. We can pull up this a little bit to give it a bit more of a peak, and more or less, we have our diamond. If we turn off X-ray mode, that's a diamond. Now we do have a bit of geometry down here that's a little messy and a little bit ugly, because we have a bunch of things just coming together here. What we can do is we can press F3 for the search menu, and then we can just collapse. You can also use the M key to get the merge menu, and then you can collapse like this. And make sure that you select all the relevant vertices, and that gets you collapsed down. Now you do need to make sure that this then connects up properly again with all the mirror modifiers, but that collapses everything down to one singular point. It also turns all of these faces into triangles, and I don't really want to give you like a super in-depth Blender modeling tutorial or anything, because frankly, I'm not an artist per se. I'm a guy that can work a little in Blender because game development. But generally speaking, you want to, for workflow related reasons, keep things as quads, as squares, as much as possible, because it maintains edge loops. If I select with these faces, for instance, you can see that I can hold down Alt and select an entire edge loop, and that will select a loop around following the flow of the geometry. When you start introducing triangles, that doesn't really work anymore. And for a lot of the actual editing operations, having good edge loops is actually quite important. And as you start destroying those, your entire workflow is going to start becoming more and more annoying to deal with. Now, one last thing is these sharp edges don't exist in the real world, right? And even within video games, if you can help it, super sharp edges, generally not a good thing. So what you want to do is the bevel that we did before. You kind of want to do that again on as many of these edges as you possibly can, just with slightly less extremity to it. But as I said, Blender has a really nice modifier system, which is non-destructive. And one of the modifiers is a bevel modifier. And this is one of those examples where you can see it only beveling the things where it has edge flow. Where it doesn't have edge flow, there's no bevel modifier. So it works really nice for this edge, but these things are still super, super sharp, which might be nice, might not be very nice. So it's good to keep this bevel modifier for this edge, but then we do need to go back in and for all these other edges, what we're just going to do, which is this one and this one only, I'm just going to manually add in a little bit of beveling. And down there, you can already see it's resulting in some problems. We'll fix that as we get to it. And while we're beveling this, might as well take these into account as well. And then immediately take these into account as well. And then this one as well. Or these two. So we can bevel all of these a little bit. And you can see immediately down there, things are absolutely breaking apart. So that's why you want to be careful with breaking these types of loops. This is fixable enough though. Just go back into X-ray mode, select everything down here, make sure that you're selecting vertices, and just, I don't know, collapse them again. It's a little messy to do it that way, but I mean, it works. And with that, we have a fairly basic, but still, we have a diamond. Now, this diamond is pretty big. If you look at the dimensions of the diamond, it's 2 meters tall, which means that if we put it into engine, it's going to be probably about as tall as our character, which is, I think, coming up to about like this line over here. At least it's going to be too big for what we need it to be. We need it to be significantly smaller. So what we want to do is we want to just press the S key to scale it down, and we want to scale it down until we get to about 0.65-ish, 650 centimeters instead. Do make sure that you press Ctrl and A and apply at least the scale, preferably also the transform, usually. And this is going to be the actual model that we export. So let's save this. I'm actually going to save this into the folder of the project files as well. So if you download the project files as a YouTube member or a patron, you're going to get this Blender file and the export from the Blender file as well. And then after we've saved it, what we're going to do is we're going to come up here into File and then Export. And you can export this as a variety of different formats. As an OBJ, I believe an STL will also work. I'm honestly just usually an FBX kind of guy, because that also tends to include things like animation data and whatever if you're animating in Blender. What we're going to be doing in this series, by the way, is we're going to be animating in Unreal, not inside Blender. So it doesn't really matter that much, but still, I'm used to doing it in FBX. Now we're going to only export the visible objects because I don't want these empties to be exported with me. And here you can set some transform stuff like the scale that you're exporting at, which axis is considered forward, which axis is considered up, all that kind of stuff. In geometry, we can say you want to apply the modifiers or not. We are going to want to apply the modifiers, of course. And then if you have any armature or animation settings, that comes in here, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So then we can export the FBX, which is great. Then back in Unreal, what we can do is I can make a quick new folder here. Let's call this level props or something like that. It's not technically a prop, it's more of a interactable, I guess. You can just drag and drop this gem FBX into here and you get this importer window. Just like with exporting, we can actually say we want to move, rotate, or scale this on import. So we can make it bigger or smaller or whatever. You can force it to be either a skeletal mesh, if you didn't export it with a skeleton or whatever, but you do want it to be treated as a skeletal mesh, something that you can do. Or the other way around. If it is something with a skeleton, but you want to import it as a static mesh, you can force it to do that. There's a whole bunch of other settings that we're not going to go over in super detail. There's some stuff about UVs, which we don't care about for this particular object at this time, because we haven't done any UV unwrapping for this. We can recompute the normals, which is the direction each of these faces is facing. If your lighting interaction doesn't work quite the way that you expect it to, this needs to either be turned on or turned off. We can import only animations, if we have animations, that is. And a whole bunch of other stuff that, again, doesn't really matter right now. What we do want to do is import the materials, in this case. If the FBX contains textures, you can automatically import the textures with it as well. All that said, let's just import this and see if we drag this into the world how big it is. And this is roughly the size that I was expecting it to be, so that is good. We, however, didn't get a material with it because I didn't make a material slot for it in Blender. We're going to make a super quick material. I'll make more in-depth videos going over setting up some more materials later as well. For now, all that we really need to do is first and foremost open this thing up to just have it open. This looks pretty good. It does smooth out a lot of the normals, which is kind of not what we want, because we did actually want those more sharp lines because of the whole, this is a cut gem. So we can look through in here for the normals and we can say, actually, I don't want to recompute the normals at all. And then if we go back through, and while we're at it, this by default has nanite support enabled. This is so low poly, you don't want this to work with nanite. So disable that. We're going to apply those changes. And then in here, we have our LOD 0. We'll talk a bit more about LODs later. This is where we had those build settings from before. We want to not recompute the normals. We don't want to recompute the tangents, nothing like that. If we apply those changes, we go back to the way that we imported it, which is with those sharper corners. Usually, it's actually kind of good that Unreal by default smooths out sharp edges, because generally you want sharp edges to be, well, not too sharp, as I said before. Sharp edges to this degree, usually kind of ugly. But here we actually want to accentuate those lines. So make sure to not have Unreal mess with your normals too much. Anyway, then we can go in and make ourselves a material, call it m_gem. And we're not going to go too deep into the materials. We also have substrate, which is a whole new material system that, again, we're not really going to work too much with. It might actually be nice for the gem, to be honest with you. But for now, We keep it pretty basic, pretty simple. One thing that is nice to do is if you have a mesh selected in your content browser, you can actually use that mesh as your preview mesh by clicking on this icon in the material editor. Quite nice. Now, the material domain is going to remain as surface. We've got a couple of different domains here, but again, not going to dive too deep into it. For the most part, if something is on a 3D model, it's going to be surface. Then we have a blend mode. If at all possible, keep this opaque. Anything else is going to increasingly be more expensive to render. We also have masked, which is a blend mode that allows you to have certain parts see-through and certain parts opaque, but nothing in between. Still not what we want for a gem. For a gem, what we really, really need is translucency. And we're going to go with translucency gray transmittance. That is just translucency that takes in a gray value, just a 0 to 1 singular value, to drive how opaque or transparent it is. So if we do this, we can see that it doesn't turn translucent at all because our opacity override is at 1. Let's set that to something like 35%, and suddenly we can see that it is translucent. 35 is a bit too translucent. Let's do 0.7 maybe. And then we can give it a nice little color. Let's make it, I don't know, green maybe. And we have a green gem. And if we then apply that, that's going to be our basic material. And in our static mesh, we can apply this material as the default for this asset, which is nice. Just drag and drop it in, and you can see our asset now by default is this green translucent material. Either way, we can go back into our BP pickup, and there we can change, finally, this ugly little cube out for our gem. And then we'll have our gem. It has this basic shape material override. If you just set it back to its default value, it'll be our green gem, and then, I don't know, it's going to be a little bit bigger. And then we can make the radius for this a little bit smaller. And just to add a little bit something to it, we also add a rotating movement component. This is going to just rotate the object in place just to make it a little bit more interesting to look at. So if we play this, we'll see these things are now rotating in place a little bit faster than maybe I would ideally want. So we go back into the pickup, rotating movements. We have the rotation rate over at the right here. We can halve that to 90. This rotation rate seems like a super arbitrary value. This is not like degrees per second or anything like that. It's just higher values, faster movement. They don't seem to represent anything sensible to me. So we have rotating movement on all of our crystals, and now we can pick them up, and we've got like things happening. It's quite neat. We made our first actual 3D model for our little game here. It's just been nice doing a little bit of art stuff after doing so much to do with all the engine stuff and all the codings. I hope this maybe also helps you get a little bit excited for materials, because we're going to be jumping deeper into that at some point as well. But now that we have collectibles, and we have a character that can technically move around reasonably well, I think next time maybe we start looking into actually building a basic level to like tutorialize the game that we're making a little bit. Both in terms of making a tutorial for you to make levels, and you making a tutorial in the game for how to play the game. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. My Cave Student tier supporters, Oiku, Earl, Monserville Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Mauricio Farias and Chang the Dude.